Well, thank you all for coming. Basically, today we're going to have some photographs, some images taken, like Dave said, by Richard Sanborn, but a few other people in this area, primarily between 1964 and 1980, which is when the last train would have rolled through town. It's an interesting snapshot of photographs taken of one of the B&M's more interesting branch lines that they operated during that time period. The Boston and Maine Railroad, of course, was the main railroad here in the area, and their branch line from East Manchester to Portsmouth was known as the Portsmouth Branch, and so that's going to be the subject of today's presentation. Before we get too far into Richard's photos from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I wanted to take it back a little bit further to the era when steam locomotives would have been used on the branch here. So this was taken over in Epping, probably about 1952. This was in Richard's collection, however, I don't believe he took the photo himself. What you're seeing here is a Boston and Maine K7 class consolidation type locomotive of the 280 wheel arrangement, which means that it would have had 2 small wheels in the front, 8 large drive wheels, and then no wheels behind it under the cab. And so it was known as a 280 type locomotive. This was what would have been used primarily for freight service on the Portsmouth branch between about 1920 and 1950, 1952. We don't have a solid date when the last steam locomotives would have been used on the branch, but we know that the branches and the lines in the Manchester and Concord area would have transitioned over to diesel power probably about 1952, 1953, and so this would have been the end of steam power on the Portsmouth branch. Yeah?
One little question. When was the last train to actually go by this depot?
The last train, as far as I know, and we'll have some pictures of getting close to it, would have been July of 1980.
Really?
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of folks have
Freight. Yeah.
A lot of folks have visited us.
Yeah, for sure. So this is over in Epping. This is probably about 1954. Towards the end of operations, passenger operations on the branch, the Boston and Maine was using a combination gas-electric car and a trailer, and that's what would have been used for passenger service right up to the end in 1954. Regular passenger service on the branch ended on July 1st, 1954. The Boston and Maine was not making a ton of money on the branch here in terms of passenger service. There was no Route 101 yet, but the state roads in the area were taking a lot of the passenger traffic, and so the Boston and Maine cut their losses and they ended regular passenger service on the branch in 1954. And the B&M sold the passenger equipment that was used on the branch regularly. They sold it to an operation called the Claremont and Concord Railroad. You can go ahead and switch. And they used the car on their line between Concord and Claremont. This is up in Bradford in the Lake Sunapee region. When the B&M sold the car to the Claremont Concord, they painted it silver and red. And they used the gas car for about a year in passenger service between Concord and Claremont before retiring the passenger service in 1955. So this is what was used on the Portsmouth branch for passenger service right towards the end in the early to mid 50s. Good. Unfortunately, the Boston and Maine, they were losing a lot of money in passenger service, but the state of New Hampshire and other governmental bodies said you can end regular passenger service on the branch, but you have to account for the passenger traffic that's still there. And so the Boston and Maine, what they did is they took one of the old wooden combination baggage passenger cars that they had lying around, and they just slapped it onto the end of the local freight and made what's called a mixed train, which is a combination freight passenger train. And so from 1954 until 1960, the local freight, which came through here, would have been a combination freight and passenger train. Now this had advantages because the Boston and Maine didn't have to run a designated passenger train, so they saved some money. But for the passengers that rode it, you were at the mercy of the freight crew. So if the train had to stop somewhere and switch out a customer, you had to wait while the train was switching out the freight cars before continuing on the line. So we don't think very many people rode the mixed train when it was running through here between 55 and 60. We do know that a lot of rail fans, however, go ahead, did ride the train. This is over in Epping. This is probably about 1960. This is a gentleman by the name of Alan Thomas, who was a well-known photographer, and he rode the mixed train quite a bit in the late 50s, early 60s. when it was still running between Concord and Portsmouth. Now, technically, the Portsmouth branch only operated Manchester to Portsmouth, but the Portsmouth branch jobs always started in Concord, and they ran down the New Hampshire main line from Concord to Manchester, and then they got on the Portsmouth branch in Manchester and ran over to Portsmouth. The Portsmouth branch is kind of interesting because compass-wise it goes east-west, but the Boston and Maine operated it in a north-south direction, so it would have been south to Portsmouth and north to Manchester and Concord. Not quite sure why they did it that way. Makes things a little confusing, but that's why they operated it like that.
Excuse me, was there a branch out of Portsmouth into Maine and all up in?
Yes, there was.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's a good question.
No one asked me that question.
Yeah, there was a main line actually. It was called the Eastern Route main line. It started in Boston.
All right, so that'd be more the south-north.
Yeah, that ran from Boston up by way of Newburyport up into Portsmouth, and then it went into Kittery up into Portland that way. Yep. Go ahead. So in 1960, the B&M sold the combine coach to the Strasburg Railroad in Pennsylvania. It's a tourist railroad, and they were starting up down in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. And so the coach is actually still down there. You can go ride it, the coach that was used through here in town. They have it named after their founder. I think it's named Donald Halleck, who started the Strasburg Railroad. But you can go and ride it. We did this a couple years ago. Stood right in the baggage opening there, pulled by a steam train through the countryside. It was beautiful. And the inside is totally restored the way it would have looked when it was built in the early 1900s. So really nice that that piece of Portsmouth branch history is actually still around and you can ride it today. Good. So that takes us up to about 1960, and we know that from about 1960 to 1963, even though the coach was gone, you could still buy a ticket to ride in the freight caboose on the local freight from Concord to Portsmouth. It's probably likely that even less people did that, although probably more rail fans were still riding the train to get pictures. But we know that probably not very many regular passengers would have done that. So this is about 1964. This is taken by Richard Sanborn, looking in an eastward direction, railroad south towards Portsmouth. And this is looking towards Main Street. You can see the crossing in the background and the station. And this is what was known as the Western Yard in town. And so basically what this consisted of was about 4 tracks. You have the branch main line, which came through here. And then there was a siding which came off the branch and came over along the freight house, which is still there, crossed Main Street, and then swung back in to connect up with the branch just a little bit past the station. This, of course, is the section house, which was moved in about 1974 to where it sits today behind the station. This track here was a siding which came off the branch just past Main Street and then came back in to connect up with the branch again behind where we're standing. And then there was another track on the other side for the tannery. And you can see this load here just poking up over these cars is, there's a couple gondola type freight cars, and there's some, I don't know what that would have been, but that would have been from the tannery. They would have loaded the cars there on that other track behind these cars you can see here. These cars in the foreground are hopper cars. They were used to ship sand and gravel out of the Manchester Sand and Gravel Pit, which was located up on Onway Lake Road, which is now the Camet Recreation Area. And the B&M would store unused hoppers in downtown Raymond when they weren't being used for sand and gravel. Same day, looking in the other direction, you can see some of those hopper cars here on the siding in the background. This is the Raymond station here, obviously. The station was sold from the B&M to private ownership not long after regular passenger trains stopped running on the line. And so at this time it would have been privately owned, not by the Boston and Maine. It was used for a number of things over the years. But in 1964 it was not owned by the Boston and Maine anymore. Go ahead. This is another nice shot looking back towards Manchester at the crossing, Main Street crossing. This was taken by Dane Malcolm, who is a well-known railroad photographer in New Hampshire, somebody that a lot of us know pretty well personally. This is the local freight, local C10, which would have left Concord and headed out towards Portsmouth. And the return job from Portsmouth to Concord was known as C9. And so this is C10 at Main Street in Raymond. The tannery is still there. You can see it poking out behind the building here. And this is an interesting piece of equipment here. This is what's known as a high rail truck. The B&M used them for maintenance on the branch and other branches. It was an international harvester truck, and it had rail wheels which came down so you could operate it on the railroad track, and then the wheels would rise back up and you can run it on a road just like a regular pickup truck. And they still use those all the time on railroads today. Good?
What would drive that?
Pardon?
How is that connected to the drive system of the truck?
So the tires actually would have rested on the rails.
Yeah.
And so as you...
So the tires still...
The rubber tiles rested on the rails, but it also had rail wheels to hold it on the track.
All right.
Yeah.
Never.
And it would have replaced the speeders like you have out here, the yellow speeder.
Yeah.
That's what they would have used before the high rails came along.
Any question?
So this is another shot. This is 1966 now, June 23rd, 1966. This is local freight C10 at Raymond. You can see here, pretty commonly, ever since the branch was dieselized in 1953 and 1954, these type of locomotives were used on the branch. These are EMD GP7 type locomotives built by the Electromotive Division of General Motors. They were 1,500 horsepower apiece, and they would have been basically what you would have seen in town from about 1953 right through until the late 70s. They were used pretty regularly on the branch. And from about 1953 until 1971 or 72, it was pretty common to see two engines on the local just about every day. Now C10 and C9 were 5-day-a-week jobs out of Concord until 1971, and then they would have dropped down to about 3 days a week. Okay. There's another shot here taken from underneath the station platform, the canopy looking towards Portsmouth. Two of the Jeeps, they were known as Jeeps, GP7s or Jeeps for short, on the local freight. Good. And another shot here, the engines kind of passing a little bit beyond the camera. If you can make it out here, the freight on the siding here, there's a couple of tank cars. One of the largest commodities shipped by the Boston and Maine over the Portsmouth branch was actually bunker C fuel oil, which came out of ship in Portsmouth. And that was shipped hot, actually. It was kept hot, and it was shipped to paper mills in New Hampshire. It was used for fuel oil at paper mills, and so that's what's in those tanker cars there. Good. Now this is the return job, C9, from Portsmouth back to Concord, crossing Freetown Road in Raymond. And it looks like the entire train on this day is just made up of tanker cars of fuel oil. And so that's how prominent that commodity was for the Boston and Maine in this time period. The paper mills were doing all kinds of business in New Hampshire. And so it was a hot product, literally and figuratively. It was hot temperature-wise, and it was hot because the cars had to keep moving. That's how they were making the money.
How would they keep it warm?
They were insulated tankers, as far as I know. Yeah, but it was just quick. They would do it every day. They would run these cars every single day, and they would try to get them to the mills as quick as they could.
Is there any history of accidents, the spillage?
Not with the fuel cars. No, not with the fuel oil.
These worlds.
Yeah, a lot different. Part of that's because the B&M and most railroads at this time had section crews, and the section house you have here would have been used by them. Each line had sections. It was broken up into sections, and each section was the responsibility of a different crew. And so you had as many as 35 or 40 people maintaining these rails at any given time, replacing ties, replacing spikes. Unfortunately, as things started to go on and the railroads started to lose money, they started to cut a lot of those positions, and that's when you start to see the wrecks and derailments. But 1964, they were still employing a lot of section men on the railroad, and the Portsmouth branch was definitely being maintained pretty regularly. Good. So this is over in East Candia. This is C9. This is the summer of 1966 now. You can see the train is made up almost entirely of hopper cars from Manchester Sand and Gravel there in Raymond, up on Way Lake Road. Huge, huge business. Sometimes they would have 5 or 6. Sometimes the entire train, 25, 30 cars, would be all sand and gravel hoppers.
Do
Yep,
you know if they were going to Boston?
partially.
'Cause
We
I
know-
A lot of truckers that came down through.
Yep.
And were hauling also.
Yeah, that's a
New road called 93 and about 20.
That's right.
those days.
That's right. Now hey Matt, that's a good point to make. In the 60s, especially around 66, 67, there was a lot of road construction going on. You had 93, you had 95. In Boston, they were looking at expanding 95. And then they were building a runway at Logan Airport as well around this time. And so a lot of these gravel pits in New Hampshire, like the ones in Bow, Raymond, Madbury, they were all shipping product over the rails to get to the Boston area. But it was also used in just regular construction as well. It wasn't just going to Boston. Good. This is another shot in Raymond. This is the summer of 67. This is the return job from Portsmouth to Concord. C9. As you can see, a lot of sandhoppers on the train on this day, stretching just about as far as you can see towards the curve, which headed off towards Freetown Road in the background. 2 Jeeps on this day, 2 Jeep 7s, 1,500 horsepower apiece. Would have been a 5-man crew out of Concord. Would have been an engineer, a conductor, head-end brakeman, a rear-end brakeman, and a flagman. And so 5 guys on the train just about every single day. This is the same, no, this is a different train. This is summer of 68 now. This is at the Old Manchester Road crossing with the elementary school back down the road behind us, or in front of us rather. Another train of sandhoppers, 2 Jeeps, pretty regular, 5 days a week right up until 71. This is what you would have seen coming through town. Nice shot. Now this is the overpass at Onway Lake Road, looking back towards Raymond and Portsmouth. This is the train as it heads towards Manchester and ultimately Concord. You can see some of the sand and gravel they would have shipped out of the pit. The pit's out of sight behind the trees in the background, but it was a pretty large facility. They had conveyor belts set up next to the tracks, which would have loaded the hoppers. They did not have a separate side track at the pit. A lot of people ask that question, did they have their own side track? They didn't. The B&M, on their way to Portsmouth, would leave the hoppers on the branch, and then they would continue on with the rest of their freight, and they would come back later in the day and bring everything down to Raymond so they could run the engines around it and then continue back to Concord. And so there's a heck of a lot going on here at this point in time. It was a major operation, and the B&M was making a good amount of money doing this. This is over in East Candia, just about where the East Candia station was. I believe it's called Depot Road in Candia, if I remember right. Summer of 68, C9, the return job from Portsmouth to Concord. I don't know if you can make it out, but the fireman is hanging out the window with a magazine. He's holding a magazine up. And I've zoomed in and I've tried to figure out what the magazine is. I don't know if it's a girly mag or what. But kind of a funny picture. And the thing I like about these shots from the 60s is that a lot of these guys at this point in time on these local freight jobs that were 5 days a week, regular hours, they had a lot of seniority. Some of these guys would have started work in the 20s or 30s on the steam engines. And so by this time they're working the diesels. It's the late 60s, but a lot of them had been around for a long time doing this. These were competitive jobs too. If you could bid on a local freight, which had regular hours, you were more likely to get it if you had seniority. A lot of the younger guys were working the mainline freights from Boston to Portland or Portland to Mechanicville, New York, which didn't have regular hours at all. And so this is pretty choice. This job was pretty choice if you could get it. One of the things I like about these shots too is that if you look closely at the crew members, everybody thinks of railroad men as wearing, gray striped caps. Well, the B&M guys, they wore white caps. I don't know why that is, but they wore white caps just like this one. And so this is basically what you would have seen the people wearing that were working the trains in the 50s and 60s.
All positions?
Trainman positions, yep. Yep, engineer, conductor, fireman.
The conductor would have that kind of...
Oh, yeah.
See that?
Yep.
I never would have
Yep.
realized that.
1969, C9, the return job from Portsmouth to Concord, is there at the Raymond station. They have a little bit of a different power setup today. They have a GP7, a Jeep, and behind it's an Alco, American Locomotive Company, RS3 type unit. Those were used sometimes on the branch interchangeably with the GP7s, but you would usually see two engines, either two Jeeps or a Jeep and an RS3, depending on what the B&M had available in Concord when they went to work that day. Really dramatic shot. This is one of my favorite Richard Sanborn shots. Crossing Freetown Road in Raymond, heading towards Portsmouth in the winter of 1971-1972. And so we start to see some real changes on the B&M in the 1970-1971 period. The Boston and Maine went bankrupt in 1970, and so things started to change in a large way for the B&M as the 70s started. A lot of their engines started to look pretty ragged. This engine would have been maroon and gold. Now it's kind of a mishmash of maroon and gold as the paint started to wear off. The B&M was running 5 days a week in 1971. In 1972, they were running 3 days a week on the branch. The reason for that is because the gravel pit here in town shut down in 1971, so they lost that traffic. The oil cars out of Portsmouth stopped running in 1971, so they lost that traffic. And then the tannery burned down, I believe, in that window as well in Raymond. And so they lost 3 pretty big customers on the branch in the early 70s, faced with bankruptcy at the same time, having to pay 5 men 5 days a week to run Concord to Portsmouth. So the economy starts to change a little bit in the 70s.
Did they have to send us something separate to plow the track, or did the train just
Sometimes.
do it itself?
Sometimes they did. It depends on the snowfall. There are some pictures of snow plows in here, but on this day they're just using the Jeeps to plow the line. Go ahead. And you can see they're just using 2 engines to plow the line.
On the social media, they had a posting, and it was a video of one of the big units going. The cloud, you couldn't see. The video was all completely covered. Yeah, snow removal was a big thing for the railroads, especially in New England. I mean, back then they got a lot more snow than we seem to get now. 69 was a big snowstorm. 77 obviously was a huge one. 71 and 72, they got a lot of snow. And so I'm not sure if they just sent these engines out by themselves to plow the line, or if they left their freight back in downtown Raymond and went ahead to Epping to clear the line to Epping. But yeah, they would use the engines. If it was really bad, they'd break out the snow plows. Now, it's also worth mentioning, too, in 1971, 1972, they were still running from Concord to Portsmouth all the way 3 days a week. However, from about 1972 onwards, they really didn't go any further than Epping. And the reason for that is from Epping to Newfields, there was absolutely no freight customers whatsoever. And so heading east to Portsmouth, Epping was the last concentration of customers before running about 30 miles with no freight customers. And so the job out of Concord would have run as far as Epping and then gone back to Concord, and Portsmouth started to be served by a freight out of Dover instead. So it just made more sense than going all the way from Concord to Portsmouth to kind of split it up into 2 sections. This is one of my favorite pictures. Not a Richard Sanborn. We don't know who. I found this slide on eBay when I bought it. I don't know who took it. But it's August of 1971. And so passenger service ended in 1954, July 1st. But that doesn't mean passenger trains stopped running on the branch completely. The B&M and the state of New Hampshire would run inspection trips on a lot of the branch lines with railroad and state officials. And so that's what this is. This is August of 71. This is an RDC, which is a rail diesel car. The B&M had 109 of these. They used them in commuter service out of Boston, but they would also use them for special occasions like this. This particular RDC, we can tell without even knowing anything else that it's the 6212, because the 6212 was the only RDC that the B&M had that had a kitchenette. And so they would use it for the inspection and official trips. And they used this car out to Goffstown. They used it down to Salem and Derry and Londonderry on the different lines in this area. And so it's kind of neat because these inspection trips after 1954, the only time you would have really seen passenger equipment on the branch. And it's kind of interesting too, because we have the number board from the 6212. There would have been 2 of these mounted on either side of the RDC. And so this came from this piece of equipment you're seeing right here. This was burned up in an arson in Cambridge in 1995. The Boston and Maine sold their RDCs to the MBTA in the 1980s. And they used them in commuter service out of Boston for about 15, 20 years before storing them in Cambridge. And so they would get lit on fire when they weren't being used. So this is another Sanborn slide. This is actually my friend Miles' collection who's here. We kind of partnered on the Sanborn stuff a little bit. This is an Onway Lake, passing the lake on its way to Portsmouth. This is interesting. This is known as the Crazy Quilt Excursion. This is May 27th, 1967. There was a group in Boston called the Railroad Enthusiasts, still is, they're still active today. And they would work with the Boston and Maine to charter special passenger trips on freight-only lines, so they could get a chance to ride the lines that were only being used for freight service. And so in 1967, they ran a trip which ran from Boston to Lawrence, and then from Lawrence, it ran up the Manchester and Lawrence branch to Manchester, and then ran over the Portsmouth branch from Manchester to Portsmouth, and then from Portsmouth went down the Eastern Route Main Line to Salisbury, and then out the Amesbury branch to Amesbury. And then they retraced their steps all the way back to Boston. And so they got their tickets worth on that day for sure. This is the train as it's arriving in downtown Raymond, May 27th, 1967. I think there was about 5 or 6 of those RDCs on this train. Yeah, this was really other than the inspection trips, which probably happened maybe once or twice a year, this is, as far as we know, the only passenger train that ever ran on the line after 1954. And here it is next to the station. They stopped for a little bit, let people off, get some pictures. These were all railroad enthusiasts, so they all had cameras with them. Richard rode the train. He rode it from Boston all the way. And so he has all kinds of pictures of this trip in different places. We have some of his shots from Amesbury. We have some of his shots in Portsmouth. But quite a day. And I'm sure a lot of the people in Raymond had no idea what was going on when a passenger train just suddenly appeared on the branch.
Question.
Yep.
Remember, I told you, I happened to be downtown waiting to cross the railroad tracks that day.
Yep.
To go to Prescott Farms for my mother, and the train stopped and people got off, and I'd never seen that before.
Yeah.
My mother told me, oh, you know, it's the last passenger train, and then Rick was able to tell me exactly what day it was.
Yep.
Because I really didn't know.
Yeah, it was quite a thing. And they ran these special trips on the line to Goffstown. They ran them up to Lincoln, New Hampshire. And so we have a lot of cool pictures from these railfan excursions that otherwise we never would have had at all. So,
What diesel determined, you know, what the weight? I would imagine.
Yep.
You're saying there was in tandem. There was 2 or 3.
Yeah.
You know, when you're pulling the gravel and stuff. But it's a passenger like that. What was the C unit that was on the pulling the passengers just now?
yeah, so those actually are self-propelled.
Self-propelled.
Yeah.
On the passenger.
Yep.
Passenger.
Yeah, the RDCs.
Yes, I've seen those
Yep.
quite a few.
Yep.
Is there a lead car?
So yeah, basically each RDC has a control stand at either end, and you can connect them up and run them from a single unit. And so it was really useful for the B&M because in commuter service in Boston, if you had a light day, you could run 1 car, but if you had a busy day, you could put 7 or 8 of them together and run them. And they were nice because you didn't have to have a locomotive to pull it. You could just run the cars by themselves. They had 2 Detroit engines underneath, and they had 2 control stands, 1 at either end. So, this is 1970 now, April. This is the Concord to Portsmouth job C10. It's taken from the cab of the GP7 on that day by Dane Malcolm. He rode from Concord to Portsmouth with the crew, and then on the way back, they let him run the engine for a little bit from Portsmouth to Epping. And so they're coming into town here. You can see the section house here before it was relocated to where it is now on this side of Main Street. And the freight house there, which was no longer being used to accept freight. It was privately owned at that point in time. And then obviously the station here. And looking back out the cab towards the station, only 1 engine on this day. You can start to see the freight business start to go down in the early 70s. They only needed 1 engine instead of 2. Now, the other thing you started to see as the 70s came around was different locomotives running on the branch. Now, from about 1953, 1954 until about 1970, it was almost always the GP7s. But in the early 70s, you started to see GP9s appear. Now, the GP9s were built in 1957 for the Boston and Maine, and they were used from about 1957 until the late 60s on the hotshot freights on the main lines. And so they didn't really venture onto the rural branch lines that much. But once the bankruptcy happened in 1970, the B&M was kind of just using whatever they could whenever they had it available. And so you started to see the GP9s appear on the branch. These were 1750 horsepower as opposed to 1500 on the GP7s. And they kind of had an interesting nickname for this paint scheme. They called them the Bluebirds because they were blue, black, and white. And so this is probably about 1971 or 72. They're using Bluebird Jeep on the local freight. They also started to use the GP18s on the local freights a little bit. These were built and ordered from EMD in 1961.
That's the class leader right there, isn't it?
Is that, yeah, 1750. They had 6 of these, 1750 through 1755. These were also mainline freight diesels until about the late 60s, and the B&M was just using them wherever they could. And so on this day, they're about to cross, I think this is Old Manchester Road in Raymond, heading back towards Manchester. The freight, as it started to drop down on the branch, you didn't have the hoppers anymore, you didn't have the tank cars. And so instead of about 20, 25 cars, the train started to be made up of anywhere from 4 or 5 to 10 cars. The big customer on the branch was Merrimack Farmers Exchange in Epping. They would get usually 4 cars a week, usually 1 or 2 at a time. And they got their cars out of the Merrimack Farmers elevator at Bow Junction, which is now Blue Seal in Bow. And the B&M would run boxcars of grain and feed and all kinds of agricultural products just back and forth from the outlet stores like Epping to the elevator at Bow. And so that was one of the big traffic on the branch. 1971, 1972, here's the local freight. They're approaching Old Manchester Road. You can see the some of the aggregate that's still there at the Manchester Sand and Gravel pit. The pit shut down in 71, 72. They started to ship a lot of the aggregate that was left that went by truck. But a lot of the machinery was dismantled, and the B&M did ship a little bit of leftover aggregate out by rail, but nothing on the level they had before. The local freight is pretty small on this day, 2 boxcars, a tank car of propane for home gas in Epping, and then the caboose. So really not much to them after 71, 72. A little bit further on down the line, this is just before Main Street in downtown Raymond. They've stopped to do some switching here, it looks like. They have 2 boxcars and a tanker car. I understand that after the tannery burned down, they did ship out some salvaged goods by rail. Things like glue stocks and that sort of thing, they did ship out. So the B&M was still doing a little bit of freight service in Raymond in the early 70s. But from about 1971 to 1972, when the gravel pit and the tannery shut down, there were no freight customers in Raymond at all. Until about 1976 when a new customer opened up. We'll talk about that in a minute. Good. This is probably one of my favorite shots that Richard took. Spring of 1970. And the train's not very prominent in this picture, but that's what I love about it because you could get up on a weekend or a weekday and go downtown and there's a train just sitting there, waiting at the crossing. You'll never be able to do that again in Raymond. And so guys like that, guys like my age that grew up in the 90s and 2000s, a decade or so after the rails were pulled up, this is about as good as it gets. You don't get to see anything else like this. And so this is looking back towards where the tannery used to stand on the other side of Main Street. There's a gondola car parked on the siding, the old freight house siding there. It's about 1970, spring. This is the same train. Richard walked over and got a nice shot of it, sitting right on the crossing. They're not running, so the crew's probably getting breakfast or something somewhere in town. Only a small amount of cars to them today. The first 2 cars are covered hoppers, which would have been destined for the Sylvania plant, which was in Greenland, right at the big railroad crossing in Greenland. There's a shopping center there now. That used to be the Sylvania plant.
Sylvania.
Yeah.
Yes, that was good.
And so that was a customer on the Portsmouth branch. And then behind it, you have a tank car for home gas in Epping, and a couple more box cars probably for the various customers in Epping. In addition to Merrimack Farmers Exchange, there was 2 farm machinery companies in Epping that got freight, and then W.S. Goodrich Brick did a lot of freight in Epping as well. 1974, 1975, they changed the symbol, so it was no longer known as C9, C10, it became Y5, Y6 out of Concord. And the Y5, Y6 local was known as the Run Everywhere local because they ran a different place every day. As the B&M started to lose a lot of freight customers on their branch lines, they would just combine the duties to make it easier. And so one day this train might have run to Goffstown on the Goffstown branch, one day it might have run to Epping on the Portsmouth branch, the next day it might have run to Derry on the Manchester and Lawrence branch. Wherever the freight cars needed to go, however many they had left, it was Y5, Y6 out of Concord that would have handled it. 1970, this is backtracking a little bit. This is still C10, C9 at this point in time, still running 5 days a week. This is heading back from Portsmouth, about to cross Freetown Road. And if you look closely, they've got a couple flat cars there behind the boxcar. The 2 farm dealers in Epping used to get International Harvester tractors, which they sold at their outlet store in Epping. And so we actually, I don't have any in this presentation, but Richard took some slides of the flat cars sitting in Epping just with brand new tractors on top of them. Right until about 1978, they were doing that. Nice shot here, 1973, 1974, the Run Everywhere local, Y5, heading out to Epping, about to cross Main Street in Raymond. They've got the flagman out front, he's going to flag the crossing for them. This engine, number 1577, is actually still around today. It's one of the only GP7s that's still left from the Boston and Maine. It was sold to an agricultural elevator in Illinois, and it's still out there being used every day. And I understand that there's a museum in New England that's going to try to bring it back. So.
Rick?
Yep.
That last shot of the building
Yep.
to the right side, I believe that's the Tucker Lodge, isn't it, folks?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, I see it.
Yep.
I see the 3 eaves to it.
Yep.
That's where it says,
And then I like the Kamets, the sign on
Yeah.
Kamets there.
Well, when you said it stopped, maybe they're having breakfast.
Yeah.
Definitely the margaritas, the Long Branch.
Yeah, yeah.
Very popular.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know somebody that rode with the crew, maybe about 1966, and he said wherever they ate had the best pie that he ever had. So, but railroad guys are famous for eating well, so there you go. Yeah, this is 1973, 1974. Really not much to them on this day. They've got a B&M boxcar, a feed for Merrimack Farmers Exchange. They have a tank car for Home Gas in Epping, and they have another boxcar, probably for W.S. Goodrich in Epping. But the B&M was losing a lot of money operating the branch. Once they started to lose a lot of the big traffic that they had in the late 60s, they were paying 5 guys to operate this branch. The maintenance was starting to fall away because the B&M was bankrupt. They couldn't maintain the track. Freight speed started to go from about 20 miles an hour in 1965. By 1976, they were running 10 miles an hour. And by 1980, they were running 5 miles an hour. That's how bad the track got. They just couldn't, the B&M couldn't afford to spend money to maintain branches that only had 5 or 6 freight customers. But they had to keep serving them because the state of New Hampshire and the customers basically said to the B&M, you know, they need your service. There's no 101 yet. So, you know, that's the only way they could get freight effectively in large bulk commodities to places like Epping. And so they had to keep operating the branch. But the B&M did try 3 times in the 1970s to abandon the branch.
Why did they had a flagman, but I thought here in Raymond it had a bar that went down.
No, Main Street never had any crossing protection other than just signs, crossbucks. Freetown Road had flashers.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, the B&M, they had a flagman employed on most of their freights, the local freights, and pretty much every crossing other than the main ones would have been flagged. They had to stop and flag it before they could proceed. Same day, heading away from us, just a nice shot. Something that would start to disappear pretty quickly. I mean, there's less than 10 years left at this point in time. So any shots that we have are pretty valuable. 1976, this is the Y6 local, so this is the return job from Epping heading back to Concord. 1730, this is one of the GP9s, one of the 1750 horsepower, 1957 GP9s with, it looks like 3 boxcars in the caboose. Coming back, about to cross Freetown Road. Yeah, this is right at the end. This is the winter of 1978, 1979. This is one of my favorite shots because the caboose here is the same type as the one that's right outside. And it's the same paint scheme too.
Same color?
Same coloring and everything.
Right.
Yeah, different number. It's a different number.
Different number, all right.
But it's
why the red ends? Like
yeah.
Everybody.
And that's why, because most people that would have remembered the trains, that's what they would have seen.
Yeah, number is C19 on it.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's another one in this presentation. I think C32 is in here, maybe 23. But yeah, one car. That's it. One car revenue. Feed for Merrimack Farmers Exchange from Bow to Epping. That's it. That's all they have. 5 guys, 5 employees run from Concord to Epping with one boxcar revenue. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I kind of like this shot because the GP7 here, 1557, the B&M celebrated the bicentennial a little bit in 1975, 1976. They painted the red, white, and blue stripe on the side. And it's still 1978, 79, it's still painted that way. You can't tell in this shot the way the lighting is, but we can place this at 1978, 1979 because the engine has, the step wells are painted orange. And that's something that the B&M did for about a year in 1978, 1979 to improve safety in freight yards. So when you step onto a locomotive at night, you can see where you're stepping. But they painted them black not too long after that, so. Yeah, it didn't do much. I guess it didn't do much. Yeah, you can see the orange step wells.
It looks good.
Yeah. In 1978 summer, this is the local coming back from Epping. They were only going as far as Epping at this point in time, most of the time. There's a few exceptions.
Yeah, the Minuteman or something?
Yeah, it is.
That's also from the bicentennial.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, the bicentennial, a couple of the engines got the silhouette of the Minuteman on the front. Kind of nice. This is Freetown Road coming back from Epping. 1 boxcar, B&M boxcar of feed for Merrimack Farmers Exchange, and the yellow boxcar is from W.S. Goodrich. So, other than the regular freight on the branch, the Portsmouth branch was really well known for becoming a detour route. And the reason for that is there was no restrictions on the branch that were low enough to prevent high and wide loads from coming over the branch. And so the B&M ran a lot of unusual moves over the branch in the 60s and 70s. This is the winter of 68, 69. This is an extra freight, so it's not the regularly scheduled freight on the branch. With a GP9, 1719, about to cross Freetown Road. Good. And you can see, pretty unusual, they're hauling, in the next slide I think I detail what is pipes and, yeah, large pipes and a unit of a tank, a pressurized tank of some sort, which came out of an engineering company in Plastow. This is not for Seabrook, although they did run Seabrook trains through here. But this is about 10 years before that, 68, 69. Really nice shot of the extra freight about to cross Main Street. I love the shot. You can't tell too well, but you'll be able to see it in the video that Art's going to put together. The brakeman's just wearing like a fedora. He's not even wearing he's not even wearing an engineer's hat. He's not even wearing no protective gear whatsoever. Back in this time, things were a lot different. The guys would wear button-up shirts. They'd wear collared shirts if they were engineers. You don't see like hard hats, you don't see safety glasses, no reflective vests, nothing like that. It was totally different.
All of us here living in Raymond, those that remember the Prescott Farms sign.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because that building that was Prescott Farms is still here.
Yep.
It's an apartment house complex now.
Yeah. Yeah, you see that sign shows up a lot. It's pretty nice. So yeah, it was a liquid oxygen unit built by Process Engineering in Plastow. And it was going towards Manchester. I don't know where it went after that, but like I said, there were no low bridges on this line. All the railroad bridges were open deck. They weren't like truss style bridges, and so there was no height restrictions. The bridge that's just down here was called Black Bridge. Every bridge on the branch was just like that, and so they didn't have any problems. starting to head away from us, heading towards Manchester and maybe Concord. I don't know if they got on the main line in Manchester and went up to Concord or not. But you can see the waiting room and the section house over there haven't been moved over across the street yet.
We did it in 78.
78?
77 or 78?
Yep.
One of those years we moved it.
So Terry asked about snow removal. This is a snow plow, extra. This is February 27th of 1972. This is a Jordan type snow plow. The B&M had snow plows built by the Russell Company and the Jordan Company. This is one of the Jordan plows right outside the Raymond station with a GP7 pushing it. And here it is crossing Old Manchester Road. It's kind of funny because I didn't have a date. Unfortunately, Richard wasn't that great about dating his slides. And slides have a processing date, so you know it had to be taken before that. But he didn't put the actual date on most of his photos. However, somebody on Facebook that I know took a picture he took of this same plow extra at Rockingham Junction, and I could see the foreman hanging out of the side of the plow with the red hard hat. And I said, you know what? He's at Rockingham Junction. He's going out the Portsmouth branch. It's got to be the same day.
That's so cool.
And he dated his and he dated his shot. And so now we have a date for this move.
That's cool.
But these were extra moves. They would have run these as needed if the snow was bad. This was not they usually didn't have any freight with them. It was just the engine and the plow. And heading away, you can see the remnants of the gravel pit there in the background. This is interesting too. If you go back, Art, you can see the hockey stick looking thing. That's called a flanger sign. And you have a bunch of them in the cage out here back, I noticed. These were all over the line. Anytime you had a crossing or a place where there would have been stuff in between the rails, you would have had those on either side of the crossing. And what that does is it tells the crew members in the snowplow to raise the blade up, which was between the rails. Because a snowplow, just like this, had the plow in the front, it had the wings that came out to plow the side, and then underneath the plow it had a blade that went between the rails to clear the snow from between the rails. Well, if you're coming up on a road crossing with pavement and you have the blade down, it's going to hit the pavement. And so these signs would have told the crew members that there was a crossing or an obstruction coming up, and to have them raise the blade until the train went over the crossing, and then they could lower it again. And so those are called flanger signs. Downtown Raymond, March 9th, 1974. Once again, Richard did not date his slides, but I know somebody that was with him that day that did date his slides. And so we have the date for this move. This is a large, I think it's an electrical generator of some sort, which ran from Portsmouth to Manchester, and then from Manchester it ran down the main line to Nashua and North Chelmsford. And after that, we don't know where it ended up.
Rick, I can also add, we were in there, that building where that train was out.
Oh, yeah?
In that time. We had bought this in 1969, but the society really was well on its way in 1974.
Yep. Yeah. So that's so we're in the place now where the train would have been. That's neat. Brand new painted engine. This is 74. This engine would have been maroon and gold like you saw before. Mid-70s, they were painting their engines in sort of a simplified blue and white paint scheme, saved a little money. And so the paint was probably brand new on this engine. Yeah, it looks great.
Amazing, yeah.
Good. There it is, 1566, GP7. Couple people checking it out. At this point in time, would have been 1 day a week service on the branch. And so anything like this would have been pretty unusual.
The kids probably were checking out because it was so flashy.
Yeah.
Brand new paint job,
Yeah.
wouldn't be surprised if like, hey.
Never saw anything like that before.
Yeah.
This is up at Onway Lake Road. The trail goes through there now. When the rails were removed, they removed the overpass. It was a wooden overpass, and they removed it and they filled it in. They just put a pipe culvert for bikers to go through. But it was a bridge when the railroad was there. And so this is the train heading towards Manchester, one shot looking back towards Raymond, the other shot heading towards Onway Lake. You can see the Jeep up here up front. My friend Julia Steer, who I went to high school with, used to live in the house right up here. And so when I would go to her house with my friends, I'd always walk over and look down into the gully where the railroad used to be. This is over in Candia. Continuing on towards Manchester, 5 miles an hour at this point in time. They would have been moving pretty slow, so it would have been easy to chase this. But there was no 101, so you'd have to take back roads. And this is one of my favorite Sanborn shots. This is the Candia station site, Main Street in Candia. There's the engine, the freight. There's a kid, a mother and a daughter with a dog here, and one of the brakemen is standing on the side of the platform. It doesn't get any better than that. And you go there today, and you hardly believe something like this would have come through Candia, New Hampshire. But pretty cool. So in addition to the high and wides and the snow plow moves, there was a few other unusual moves that ran on the branch, maintenance moves to keep the tracks maintained. The B&M, even though they were bankrupt, they were still doing maintenance jobs on their lines. And so this is probably a tie job. They probably had a section crew come through and remove old ties and put the old ties next to the track. And then they would have had this train come through with the open gondola cars and the crane, and they would have picked up whatever debris they had left behind and bring it out. So this is West Epping. This is heading towards Raymond in the summer of 1974. You can see the crane,
Wow, yeah.
American company crane. The B&M had a few of these. They were actually self-propelled. They could run on their own. But usually the B&M just ran them in with a train, made it easier that way. And the train heading away. West Epping, once again, the summer of 74, the track, the maintenance of the track wasn't as good as it had been, but they still had to keep the trains moving, still had to get the freight out to Epping, so they were running. Really nice shot. Richard probably has more shots of this engine, the 1570 on this branch, than any other GP7, and so for that reason, that's my favorite GP7. But it was out here a heck of a lot in this time period. The extra they've tied down here at the station. They're probably getting lunch. And you can see the work extra here right in front of the station. There's the crane, American company crane.
Well, they had your name on the side of the car.
They did. It's just so, it blows me away, because I lived in Raymond for about 5 or 6 years, and I'd come down here on weekends or something, and just the idea that you could come down here on a weekend and see a train parked out front with a crane and a Jeep on front and everything. It's such a foreign concept to people my age that when you see stuff like this, it blows you away. When they lost the railroad, they really lost something that the railroad can only bring to a town. The trail is nice. The B&M wasn't making any money on the line, so it had to go. But it definitely lost something that will never be brought back. And it looks like there's a kid down. Boy, what I wouldn't do, but there he is, checking out the train. Tannery's long gone at this point, burned down, torn down.
Looks like the fence still needs fixing again.
Yeah. Some things never change. Yeah, the siding here, the freight house siding, which crossed Main Street, by 1974 probably wasn't being used at all. So.
I was just wondering when that water tower was taken out, because that was...
Oh, the water tower?
The transfer, right.
Yeah.
The change to your diesel engines. You seem that you definitely have the knowledge of all of these units.
Yeah.
The regular steam engines didn't have to pull that heavy because that mining wasn't going on.
Right.
Was it just the regular size steam engines that would,
Yep.
in the early, before the diesels that you all the different units that you've been calling off?
Yeah, so the steam engine we saw at the beginning would have been the biggest
it.
the biggest steam engine you would have seen.
And that would,
Yeah, I don't think, by 1952, the water tower was gone.
yeah.
They weren't taking on water here. I would say the water tower was probably gone in the 20s.
Yeah.
Because the steam engines got bigger, they could carry more water.
We have the schoolhouse there now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably not there in the 30s, 40s, I would think.
What were they fueled by? A combination of coal and wood? Did they have the option?
Yeah, it would have been all coal by this point.
Okay.
Yeah, the wood.
Wood was earlier?
Oh yeah, wood went away probably by 1900.
Okay.
That's when they would have switched over on railroads to coal. Yeah, and these were just diesel fuel. This is 1976, the summer, crossing Freetown Road. I think this is a nuclear waste cask coming out of Kittery.
Yeah, either
I think that's
either Seabrook or Kittery.
Seabrook or Kittery.
Yeah.
Where was it headed?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, this is 76, so Seabrook's not done yet.
No.
So this has got to be out of Kittery.
Out of the Navy Yard.
Yeah, out of the Navy Yard. This is 1557. We saw it earlier, a few years after this. They haven't painted the stepwells orange yet, but still in its bicentennial scheme, crossing Freetown Road. Really nice shot. And they're down by the depot.
Is that one of the B&M orange gauze?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were brand new at this point too.
Yeah.
They didn't stay orange very long. Yeah. But there's, you got your brakeman up front. I mean, just a classic shot. This is the 70s, you know, this is the B&M on just about every rural branch line they operated in the 70s. Right towards the end, late summer of 1979, an extra, a generator. I think this is for Seabrook because it's heading towards Portsmouth, right before Main Street in Raymond. The B&M embargoed the branch in the winter of 1979. The state wouldn't allow them to abandon the branch. The B&M was losing money, and so what they did is they just said, hey, we can't run the branch anymore because of the track conditions are bad. In the winter, we're really worried about the winter, and so in the winter of 1979, they embargoed the line, which meant that from East Manchester to Rockingham Junction in Newfields, the branch was taken out of service. But that's not when the last train ran on the line. And so there's a little bit of a story there. And there it is. There's your N5 type caboose, just like the one that's in the exact same spot today. It's a different number than the one you have. But there's only months to go left
It
here.
would have been cheaper if they left it though.
Yeah. You wouldn't have had to truck it from Portsmouth. That's right. That's right. Yeah, this is right towards the end. At this time, the local freight would have been only running 1 day a week from Concord to Epping. I think they stopped going to Epping in the fall of '79, and the branch wasn't used from the fall of '79 until the spring of 1980. They were using the branch as far as East Manchester every day, because a switcher crew out of Manchester Yard would serve. There was a ton of customers in Manchester on the Portsmouth branch. And the line from Rockingham Junction to Portsmouth was still busy every day. It still is. It's still in place today. But the line from East Manchester to Newfields, not much going on. Until the very end of 1979, this is late summer, early fall, CO1, the Concord-based local, it was called Y5, Y6, now it's called CO1. One engine and one boxcar, that's it. This is a load of brick going to W.S. Goodrich. They did get some brick in by rail that they sold at their store. And so this is Epping. This is crossing Railroad Ave in Epping. This is the gas plant that I mentioned earlier, Home Gas. They got propane cars. And this line here is the old Fremont branch, which left Epping and ran to Fremont. And they last saw traffic in 1971. 71 to Fremont. It was the barrel, the cooperage in Fremont. That was the last rail customer. And so 71 was in the last train.
How did they turn it around? Or
Yep.
Is there a turnaround?
No, so
Come back up? Or?
yeah, so once the steam engines were gone, turntables kind of became pointless because you don't have a tender.
Yeah.
So running in reverse with a tender first is kind of tricky. But diesels, the sight range is so much better. So they would have just used an adjacent track. They would have disconnected the engine at one end, ran it on an adjacent track, and coupled it up to the other end. Yeah. So. And yeah, this is them. They're about to cross 125. 125 is just behind us. And the W.S. Goodrich plant, of course, was right there on 125. God, I remember when it was still there. One boxcar, a brick, and that's it. I don't know what happened to the caboose. They should have a caboose on there, but they don't. It might have derailed. I know there's a couple. You guys have a couple pictures of a train up by the old gravel pit, and the caboose is derailed, and that's right at the end. The pictures you guys have is right at the end. And so maybe that's what happened on this day too. The branch was in just such bad shape. So I said that the B&M had embargoed the branch in the winter of 1979. Now in 1976, a new company moved into Raymond and set up a plant just west of the Freetown Road crossing called Rerig Pacific. And they got in hopper cars of plastic pellets. And so in 1976, they were a brand new customer in Raymond. 1979, the winter of 1979, the B&M embargoes the branch. If you read the abandonment documents for the branch in 1982, when they finally got permission to abandon the branch, it says that a couple carloads of plastic pellets did make it out to Raymond in July of 1980, despite the branch being embargoed. I don't know why they ran out there. I don't know if the B&M officials knew about it, but this is July 21st, 1980. This is East Manchester. This is Taylor Street with Mammoth Mills and Mammoth Road in the background. And they have one hopper car and one caboose. And the only customer from East Manchester to Raymond that would have gotten these kind of hopper cars would have been Rerig Pacific. And so this very well might be the very last train to ever run through Raymond, because it's July 21st, 1980, and late July is when the very last train ran to Raymond. So this could be it. I mean, if they were getting one car a week, this is probably the last train that ever came through here. I have been trying in vain to find a shot of this locomotive in Raymond, because this is a GP 40-2. These were brand new. These were delivered in 1978. And so this would have been the largest and heaviest locomotive ever used out here. And we know it was in Raymond at one point because it's got the hopper car from Freetown Road. So there's got to be a shot of it by the station in somebody's attic. But who knows? So the B&M, they finally got permission to abandon the branch in 1982. They had been trying since about 1972. Every time the state came in and said, you can't abandon it, they're still making, there's still companies that are relying on you. But by 1982, the B&M was losing so much money, the maintenance was so bad. And the prospect of 101 was starting. I believe 101 was completed to a certain point at this point. I don't think it was all the way to Epping yet, but it had gotten quite a distance. And so the B&M was finally given permission to abandon the branch from East Manchester to Newfields in 1982. The section from East Manchester to Manchester Yard remained in service until 1989. And of course, the section from Newfields to Portsmouth is still in use today. But the middle 25, 30 miles or so was abandoned in 82. And that's when they started to rip the rails out in 83, 84.
Rick, do you know what happened to the rails? Did they get hauled in certain places?
Yeah, they would have reused them elsewhere, probably.
They melted down?
No, they would have just sent them to a line that needed new rails. And
We have a few.
yep, I'm glad you grabbed some. Yeah, they came through with tractors and they just pulled the rails apart. They didn't even bring a train through to pull them out.
No, they're set length. What are those lengths? You know?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, but they would have been all the same length. Yeah. This is Depot Road in Epping, West Epping. And so after they had pulled the rails off, they came through and they took the railroad ties out of the ground, they bundled them together. And they would have sent them off probably to be mulched somewhere. This is West Epping looking towards Raymond. This is 1984, I believe. They started at Rockingham Junction in Newfields, and they worked their way towards East Manchester. Another shot, the bundled ties. And this is closer to Raymond. This is that swampy area just about at the town line. They had pulled the rails apart, but they hadn't gotten this far with the rail removal yet. This is just west of Freetown Road. You can just see the switch for Rerig Pacific. I've never seen a shot of the plant. I've never seen a shot of a freight car at the plant. These are the only shots I have of the siding itself, which was built in 1976. And so that's pretty late. I mean, considering the branch was last used in 1980, the fact that they got a new customer in 1976 and was actually increasing carloads to Rerig Pacific in 1978 and 79. So the business was starting to go up, but not enough to justify running 25 miles from Manchester. So there's the switch there. The building is still there. It's been built onto. I don't know what's in there now, but the section of the building where the rails came up alongside the building, they built an extension onto. So
imagine if the pricing of gas or diesel fuel,
Yeah.
everybody, for the truckers that finally took over.
Yeah.
To eliminate the use of the train.
Well, it was
and that business grew.
Yeah.
Money, I'm sure, took over. But if they were paying the prices of today, the ballpark of.
Well, things were different then too. I mean, you had union rules. You're paying 5 guys, 5 crew members, sometimes with 1 or 2 cars of revenue. But also at the same time, nowadays, we see propane plastic. A lot of that's going by rail because it's bulk. But back then, they weren't doing a whole lot of bulk shipments. So it was a lot of 1 or 2 cars a week at small companies. So it was totally different back then. Yeah. And I think there's one more shot of the siding here. Yep. Building would have been just out of sight behind here. Switch stand and a derail. Yeah, just in case the cars rolled away. They would have derailed the cars before they came out onto the main line. That's it. One more shot, a Sanborn shot, a little bit of a more positive shot at East Candia, looking back towards Raymond, when the rails were still in. And you could see trains come through here once, twice, 3 times, 5 times a week, depending on the time period. So thanks to Richard, we have all this wonderful material to look at. Richard passed away in 2010. I never got the chance to meet him. He was a school teacher in Hampton Falls for years, beloved school teacher. I think the playground is named after him. They have a bench with his honor and everything. But he was the documenter of the railroad in this part of the state for about 25, 30 years. Thankfully, thanks to him, we have these shots that a lot of us didn't get the chance to see, and so it's the only chance we'll ever have to experience it ourselves. If you're interested in learning more, like I said, I'm with the B&M Historical Society. We have a website, we have a YouTube channel. We actually have a series where we go around New Hampshire.
Thank you.
Thank you.